Hi everyone, this is our presentation on war and architecture. So as we have learned in the past lectures, war has heavily influenced the art world. We have explored art post-World War I and World War II. However, architecture has been greatly affected by war, conflict, and violence since before the Middle Ages. Architecture is not only physical, but also holds meaning in terms of defining spaces, acting as fortification and protection, being a form of division between people, while also enabling a sense of unity between those within the barriers created by architecture. As architecture holds so much meaning, it establishes power, which unfortunately can also enable oppression. Those who want to overpower others and take over space do so through the destruction of architecture and its intended meaning. Destruction of architecture is an effective way of erasing memories of a community, its presence from a location, as well as erasing the sense of security amongst communities. For example, in Nazi Germany, they were destroying Jewish synagogues as ethnic cleansing. Architecture has adapted and evolved over centuries in various ways in response to conflict and war zones. We have seen architectural innovation sprout from the Middle Ages, the World Wars, and unrest in the Middle East. In preparation for war, architecture was focused on incorporating defensive fortification. In the Middle Ages, forts were created as fortification, hence the name fort. The power over fortresses was associated with royalty, and this is where we see the start of a connection between architecture and social and political power. Here we have a photo of the Harlech Castle in North Wales, which was built from 1283 to 1290, and is known to have been held under siege during the War of the Roses. This fortress is built of sandstone and consists of high defensive walls. Of course, the history of architecture started way before the Middle Ages, but here we start to understand how the destruction of architecture influences who is in power. When discussing this topic, we can analyze the effects on architecture before war, as well as the effects on architecture after war. In this presentation, we will be focusing a lot on architecture post-war, which was designed to inspire healing within a nation as they adapt to their new life after war. According to Lebbeus Woods, a famous American architect and author, post-war reconstruction projects should be rebuilt according to three principles. The first principle, restore what has been lost to its pre-war condition. For example, the Frauenkirch Church, which was destroyed in World War II in 1945, it lay in ruins until it began reconstruction in 1994. The second principle is demolish the damaged and destroyed buildings and build something entirely new. For example, the World Trade Centers were demolished and a 9/11 memorial site was constructed in its place. The third principle is the post-war city must create the new from the damaged old. In other words, find a new purpose for the old building. A good example of this is the Flak Towers in Vienna, Austria, which were used as bomb shelters and have now been repurposed in various ways, such as an aquarium and an art museum. Keeping these principles in mind, famous architects have designed some of the most influential buildings due to the impacts of war. Throughout this course, we've explored art movements that have been influenced by war. Constructivism was a way for the Russian government to connect to their people. After the 1917 Russian Revolution, Soviet Union used constructivist architecture in the 1920s to realize the new change to socialism through the urban environment. Artists were now being seen as engineers and builders, and their work was expected to be social in its purpose and function and should relate to life. The constructivist movement brought architecture combined with modern technology and engineering, for example, incorporating concrete frames as well as radio antennas. Here we see a picture of the Shukov Tower, built in 1920 to 1922, and was designed by Vladimir Shukov. It is a broadcasting tower that lights up at night and was constructed out of minimal lightweight metals due to the shortage of metals during the Russian Revolution. The Art Deco movement was a prevalent art movement that spanned the time between World War I and World War II. Art Deco was very playful and glamorous, and people were drawn to it as they yearned for a stylish life that distracted them from the horrors of war. Art Deco architecture would incorporate expensive materials such as glass, stone, aluminum, steel, and terracotta. Here we have a picture of the Chrysler Building in New York City, which was designed by William Van Allen in 1928. It's very industrial looking, sleek, and ornamented with metallic points to embody the feel of America after the First World War. So from modernism in America after World War II came brutalism. Brutalism, which we have discussed in lecture last week with the example of the Church of Light by Tadeo Ando, was widely adapted by architects after the Second World War, as brutalism was obsessed with concrete, which was a strong and cheap material for architects to design with, considering there was a material shortage after the war. British and Eastern European countries, heavily influenced by socialism, wanted to rebuild efficiently and therefore tasked architects during this time to build housing and institutions affordably and efficiently as nations were recovering from the war. This shift to socialism was reflected in their desires for brutalist architecture to be very utilitarian, non-decorative, and soulless, which was a big change from the previous Art Deco movement. Here we see a picture of Cité Radieuse, also known as Unité d'Habitation, which was designed by architect Le Corbusier in 1947 to 1952 in France. He designed many influential brutalist buildings that incorporated concrete columns, such as this one. One could say that there is a lack of diversity amongst these buildings in terms of materials used in brutalist architecture, but this is what defined this art movement in terms of architecture.
The reading we found most connected to our presentation topic for this week is Learning from Architecture and Conflict by Bridget Picard and Mark Swinnerton. It is a 2011 issue in the Journal of Architecture. The article consists of select papers used to combine a range of theoretical concerns with case studies of key cities and regions. The article begins with a look at the role of frontiers in contested cities and at the spatial aspects of humanitarian interventions, followed by two sites of urban conflict, Belfast and Jerusalem. The closing three papers look at the role that architecture creativity might play in relation to violence and conflict. The fear of otherness or the anxieties of differences lead to closures and segregation through separation walls or fences and the other elements of the wall system. The purpose is to differentiate and segregate cultures, people, and ideologies. Wendy Pollan, featured in the article, talks in her paper on how this creates a sense of being imprisoned in one's own land and own home, especially when, for example, in a case of the frontiers dividing Israeli and Palestinian people in Jerusalem, she mentions how it is not only taking place in the city's outlying lands, but also in its historic core. These physical barriers can lead people to create mental walls as well, and separation walls become both the physical embodiment of symbolic violence and the emblem of eliminating of the others. The article mentions how Camilo Buono shows in his paper that most of the time, both the spatial dimension and the need for conflict understanding or sensitivity are neglected by activists and architects working on conflict transformation and post-conflict contexts. Mostly, the focus of studies about architecture and conflict is the destruction of symbolic architecture and heritage, the politics of urban planning under occupation, and the physical rebuilding after conflict. But it lacks understanding of the potential that architecture can offer for transformation and building a sustainable peace. For those living their daily life under siege, the culture of war and occupation is a major source of vulnerability, but it also triggers coping strategies in the form of creative responses, for example, symbolic reoccupation of spaces, graffiti and wall painting, streets, theater, or installation architecture. This is a quote from the article that says, obviously, working on architecture and space alone cannot reduce or transform conflict, but understanding the spatial dimension of conflict can be crucial in bringing about a comprehensive response to conflict. The paper discusses two sites of urban conflict, Belfast and Jerusalem, to elaborate on the impact of conflict on architecture as a professional and creative practice, and the violence involved in the invasion, occupation, or destruction of ordinary houses. To put it briefly, in the case of Belfast and the impact conflict has on the creative aspect of architecture, Ruth Morrow, Kieran Mackle, and John Dixon Fitzgerald discussed the fear of falsifying historic buildings or harming their authenticity in the process of reconstruction and how this might lead to overlooking the needs of people living in that space. And in the case of Jerusalem, it shows how the conflict can become a war by architectural proxy, where homes are torn down because they are pronounced illegal for security reasons or as a punitive act. In these cases, Terry Mead says that all sense of protection and security for the families is destroyed, both physically and mentally. The last section of the paper features authors who reflect on the role of creativity in relation to conflict and violence. Again, to summarize, Cole Priest explores attacks on architecture as retaliation, including historic buildings or cities or even simple houses. And a way to think about this is to have an understanding of the culture of war and occupation, influenced by threats and feelings of fear. This can also be understood as a form of symbolic violence, defined by Pierre Bourdieu as invisible soft violence, which aims specifically to disrupt the roots, grounded values, and symbolic expression of a group of people. In this way, violence becomes a form of emotional expression. The result can be a major root cause of conflict. Ken Starrett, Mark Hackett, and Declan Hill discuss how, during war or an occupation, populations are stripped from their historic narrative. But in an effort to keep the narrative alive, people turn to visual records, capturing anthropological testimonies and life stories, undertaking archaeological excavations, and creating living museums. A living museum is a type of museum which recreates historical settings to simulate a past time period, providing visitors with an experiential interpretation of history. And lastly, the paper by Golzari and Sharif touch on the topic of how reconstruction after conflict requires a lot of thinking and planning because, and I quote, the choices made will shape not just the urban fabric, buildings, and spaces, but also social relationships, collective identities, and sense of belonging, and the opportunities to move towards a sustainable peace. Connecting our presentation topic to this article, we can see how people used architecture for fortification and protection in terms of the physical buildings, as well as symbolic meanings and feeling safe within walls during times of conflict and war, in addition to post-conflict. We can also see the connection with the concept of separation walls and how they divide people, cultures, and ideologies, whereas it can also form unity, power, and a sense of belonging between populations within those barriers. And finally, we can see that architecture is more than just building blocks. It has more power, holds more meaning within its structures, and embraces memories that influence people around it.
Hello, I'm going to be showing you some examples of the kind of architecture discussed in the reading, 2 of which are conflict inciting and 2 that are conflict diffusing. The first example is the Ingle House in Tel Aviv. It is a great example of how, as the reading demonstrates, architects in conflict zones can use their practice to strategically alter the meaning of existing concepts. In the 1930s, Jewish architects began building Bauhaus buildings, such as the Ingle House in Tel Aviv. However, by completely divorcing the style from its original context, they were able to use it to further their cause, in this case, using it to signal the strength of the Zionist movement. Clearly, architecture is its own sort of battleground, where opposing groups fight for the ability to define meanings. As this example illustrates, this struggle inevitably involves erasing any trace of the other. Indeed, Tel Aviv's Bauhaus architects purposely chose this modern style to differentiate their buildings from traditional Arab ones. Undoubtedly, architecture is not just about functionality. It is deeply symbolic of the culture that surrounds it. So much so that to harm a building is to harm a culture. And this next example really shows that. Over the 4 years that Sarajevo was under siege, the Bosnian Serb army inflicted catastrophic damage on the city's architecture. Though they saw this as a routine part of war, the citizens of Sarajevo had a completely different perspective. Destroying their cultural institutions, like the Sarajevo Library as shown on the slide, was a direct assault on everything they stood for. Even though, as Hirscher argues in his article on the subject, relationships to such institutions do not completely define a person, these types of feelings often arise because war has a tendency of delineating cultures. Simplifying them to their core elements, it facilitates the creation of the sharp divisions that act as its life source. Now that we've looked at how architecture has been used to promote war, I am going to show examples that use the peace-building techniques discussed in the reading, starting with Cinema Sans Souci. Cinema Sans Souci was a movie theater in apartheid South Africa. It was important to the area's black population, acting as a place where they could support one another and build community. Unfortunately, it was destroyed by fire in 1995, but that hasn't stopped local inhabitants from reclaiming its ruins. By hosting film screenings, dance workshops, festivals, and other cultural events, they keep the spirit of Cinema Sans Souci alive, helping the community heal from the violence inflicted upon it. They also take control of the narrative, relinquishing ownership of their stories from the oppressor, and in doing these things, they make it possible to move forward. A second example is the Maria Grazia Catulli School in Afghanistan. Maria Grazia Catulli was an Italian journalist in Afghanistan who was murdered in 2001. The school was built in memory of her. Meant to act as a sign of peace, the building aims to provide an innovative alternative to the educational spaces typically related to after-war reconstruction emergencies. I think the key word here is alternative. In this example and the last one, both groups used architecture to make their ideals concrete. And in this way, they make their departure from the turmoil of the past unmistakable and make space for that brighter alternative to thrive and grow. Without a doubt, by transforming the abstract to the tangible, Architecture is uniquely suited to forge new realities and create lasting change.
Thank you for listening to our presentation. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on this topic in the discussion board.